welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 and on Channel 9, and later on will be available on YouTube at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and today I am delighted to welcome David Brody here. David is a 12-time Amazon #1 best-selling fiction writer with more than 500,000 books sold. Congrats on that, Dave.
Thank you.
He's the author of 22 books, and he's a graduate of Tufts and Georgetown Law School. He served as director of the New England Antiquities Research Association and is an avid researcher in the subject of exploration of America before Columbus. He's frequently appeared as a guest expert on documentaries on everything from the History Channel to the Travel Channel, PBS, and the Discovery Channel. He was raised not far from here in Laconia, New Hampshire, and he currently resides right here in Newburyport with his wife, sculptor Kimberly Scott. His new book is called The Essex Junta, Newburyport, and the Three World Wars, and it's number 19 in his Templars in America series, but it can also be read as a standalone mystery and thriller. And so, Dave, first of all, thank you so much for coming to visit the morning show. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Mary. It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
Very much. You're an avid researcher, as I mentioned, and unlike most novels, your book actually has source footnotes at the end about Newburyport figures. People will recognize the names of Caleb Cushing, Albert Pike, and of course Lord Timothy Dexter, as well as the Knights Templar, the Freemasons, and the Theosophical Society, all of which play a role in the plot. And you describe the Essex Junta as faction, F-A-C-T-I-O-N.
Yes.
So I was hoping we could start with your defining faction for us and explain why and how you blend historical source materials that you research with the elements of a mystery, a thriller, and historical fiction.
Right. So I think the difference is when you talk about like a historical thriller, usually those are written at a certain time period. So if you're writing a historical thriller about the Revolutionary War, the action takes place in the 1770s. My books are triggered by history, historical mysteries, historical artifacts, but they're set in modern time. So similar to, say, National Treasure or the Da Vinci Code. But the idea is it's historically based, so it's in one sense a historical thriller, but it's not set in a historical time period other than the modern one.
Yeah.
So I call them faction, and the reason I use the word faction is because they're fact-based.
Yeah.
The history I write about is all authentic history. And oftentimes I get questions from readers, oh, you talked about such and such an artifact or such a site or such and such a piece of artwork. Is that real, or did you just use that as part of the story? And the answer always is it's real. If I write about it in the stories, it's real. So as the readers go along, they'll see a footnote. That doesn't mean you need to go and check the source. It just means, yes, this actually is an authentic letter from Albert Pike to Giuseppe Mazzini, for example. I'm not making that up as part of the story. And so the readers can know that the foundation of the story is factual, it's historical, even though they're oftentimes obscure and sort of dusty corners of history that I go into, but it is actual history.
Which means it's a learning opportunity about history as well as a very enjoyable kind of modern suspense plot.
That's the goal. So at one point,
you succeed.
No, thank you. Publishers Weekly once said Brody does a terrific job of wrapping his research in a fast-paced thrill ride. Nothing could have made me happier than that.
That seems like a very accurate description.
That's my goal. Thank you, Mary. I'm glad you like that. So.
Well, you know, the Essex Junta is set in Newburyport, and anybody who lives in the area will really love being able to visualize settings such as the Lord Timothy Dexter Mansion, Cashman Park, the Museum of Old Newbury, Plum Island. But it is also a thriller, and a very gripping thriller, and it contains chase scenes and plot twists within plot twists within more plot twists. So just please give folks an overview of the book's plot and premise.
Right, so the idea is, the whole thing is really focused on this idea that there were these powerful shipping families here in Newburyport after the Revolutionary War. They were doing very well. Newburyport was a bustling trade area, much as all of the North Shore was Salem and Marblehead and Ipswich and Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But then a series of things happened. In 1807, President Jefferson put an embargo on trade because he was having difficulties with the English. And then in 1811, there was a big fire in downtown Newburyport, which devastated the Market Square area. And then in 1812, the War of 1812 hit. And all of a sudden, Newburyport, the economy basically died. And these shipping families have been very powerful and very wealthy, got together and said, this just isn't working for us. And they started to agitate this idea that they wanted to secede, that the New England states should secede from the Union and form, maybe join up with some of the maritime provinces in Canada. And this group was called the Essex Junta. I changed it to Junta, which is the modern spelling. And this group, they went so far as to have a big convention in 1814 in Hartford, where they were going to sit down and have a vote, should we secede? The War of 1812 ended right at that same time, so they never ended up doing it. But the premise of the story is that these shipping families, very powerful, very many names that we would recognize, continued to agitate for secession in the decades after the War of 1812, leading up to and including the Civil War. And that may have been what brought about the Civil War, that maybe we can point the finger here to Newburyport and say the reason we had a Civil War wasn't just because of the South, but because of these powerful families here on the North Shore in Essex County. The Essex Junta is Essex County. And it's a fascinating little dusty corner of history that I never knew about before.
I had never heard about it until I came across it in your novel, and it is absolutely fascinating that these forces were there kind of agitating on their own behalf from very early on in our nation's history.
Right. They were working closely with, at the time, Vice President Aaron Burr. Alexander Hamilton found out about this, and this is what led to the famous duel between Hamilton and Burr. I mean, there's lots of different tentacles coming in from history, but that's what sort of triggers the story. That and some letters that were discovered up in Canada a few years ago, written by a very famous Freemason by the name of Albert Pike. In the second half of the 1800s, he was the most powerful Freemason. He was a Confederate general. Some viewers may remember that in 2020, I believe, during the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Washington, D.C., his was a statue that was pulled down, the noose put around it, it was burned. Why that's important, his letters sort of trigger everything. Why that's important is Albert Pike was a son of Newburyport. Even though he was a Confederate general, he was the Grand Dragon of his state Ku Klux Klan. He was sort of had some nasty things going on, but originally he spent his childhood up until he was about 22 years old in Newburyport, and he was mentored by a gentleman by the name of Caleb Cushing. The Cushing Mansion is where we have the Museum of Old Newbury. That's his house. He was 9 years older than Pike, and they had a mentor relationship that continued because Cushing became a congressman, moved down to Washington, D.C. Pike eventually found his way to Washington, D.C., and they had a continual relationship. So we have this odd pairing of the congressman and powerful figure from Newburyport and the Confederate general down in Washington, D.C., in the person of Pike. And that led to a lot of what happens in the story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people in this area, they may have heard the names Albert Pike and Caleb Cushing.
Especially Cushing, yes.
And just not realize some of the nefarious things they were involved in.
Right. Cushing himself was a lawyer and a politician, but his family was very big into trade. They had the Cushing Wharf down on the waterfront and the clipper ships, of course. And Cushing continued to make a number of bad real estate investments over his career, so he needed to turn back to his father and then his brothers and have the family fortune sort of bail him out. So this is sort of the root of all of this, is that the trade families here, they needed, in order to trade, they needed goods to export to Europe. And the best thing they could do was to get cheap textile goods, cotton, from the South and export that. In order for that to happen, they needed slavery in the South. So while most people in New England opposed slavery and were abolitionists, we have famous abolitionists here with John Greenleaf Whittier and William Lloyd Garrison. Cushing and his family and some of the Essex Junta trade families went the other way. They wanted the South to be able to continue slavery so they could have goods to export. And that's sort of the tension that was going on. And that's why Cushing and Pike, they found common ground, because both of them wanted to allow slavery to continue in the South.
And the famous phrase, the triangle trade, which a lot of people, I think, are not fully aware of, that involved also slavery in the Caribbean states, bringing sugarcane up. And there were so many, I think there were 12 rum distilleries in Newburyport in the early 1800s as well. So these were forces, again, these kind of significant chapters of history that I know I was never taught about. And I think that your book does a really good job kind of raising some of these to the forefront.
Right.
So
I actually live in a condo complex that used to be a rum factory.
Oh, no kidding.
The River's Edge complex was the site of Caldwell Rum. So,
oh, right. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so there was a number of them along the waterfront there,
Right.
and that was a big part of the slave trade. Brought a lot of money into the port cities of the North Shore.
So there was a lot more dissension around, or different points of view about slavery than the one we like to claim
Right.
For the North in general, especially New England.
Right.
Well, you know, Dave, the Essex Junta involves the plot involving these oligarchic families, so to speak, trying to solidify their power and wealth to bring about basically a new world order, and it's so timely. So let's name some names, so if you don't mind.
Sure.
Who were the Essex Junta families? Because people will recognize some of the names. And what type of new world order did they aim to bring about?
So some of the names that you'll recognize today, we have names, we mentioned Cushing and Pike, but there's also Pickering from Pickering Wharf, and Weld, Governor Weld, Forbes, John Forbes Carey, Lowell, Cabot. There's that famous statement that the Lowells speak only to the Cabots and the Cabots speak only to God.
Oh, yes.
We think of them as
Right.
Boston families, but they have North Shore roots.
Yeah.
The number of the Perkins, a number of these families, a lot of them became very philanthropic and donated money to do things, to form things like Mass General Hospital and the Museum of Fine Arts and the Perkins School for the Blind. But back then, they were shipping families, and it was all about trade. And in order for them to be successful, they needed trade. And so whether it was trading in slaves, or later on trading in opium, which we might talk about later, or getting cheap textiles from the South through slavery so they could export, it was all about trade. When we talk about the New World Order, that's more of a sort of a modern day conspiracy thing. People are playing connect the dots and saying some of these families that made all their money back in the early to mid 1800s, they're still in power today. These are names we still recognize today.
Yeah.
And because these families had such close associations with some of these secret societies that we know about, the Freemasons, Skull and Bone Society at Yale, the Illuminati, I go deep into this in the book. A lot of these families are also closely allied with these secret societies. And the theory is that these families were using these secret societies sort of as infrastructure to agitate and manipulate, and eventually, again, what they wanted to do, if they could, was bring about some kind of conflict between the North and the South so that the South would be able to maintain and keep slavery. Then the question is, does that stuff continue beyond the Civil War? I'm pretty comfortable saying it. You know, I can prove the case that up until the Civil War, yes, that was happening. Some people go further and say it continued all the way through World War I, and World War II, and up to today. And we have these societies still continuing to try to work for a new world order and taking over the government through some kind of authoritarian global oligarchy. I'm not sure that that's really happening, but there are some who believe that it is. And that's one of the themes that we explore in the book.
Time will tell.
Right.
But what should we say? The breadcrumbs are sprinkled throughout history, and that's some of the evidence that is footnoted in your book, especially regarding these secret societies, which I want to ask you more about in a minute. But you also mentioned the opium trade, and one of the things I learned a lot about the prominence of the opium trade from your book, and how damaging it was, especially to China. And so I was hoping that you might tell us a little bit more about the prominence of the opium trade and the human toll that it took.
Right. So,
on people.
So originally the slave trade was the big thing, the triangular trade. At a certain point, politically and economically and even morally, it became more and more difficult for these. For the slave trade to continue. It became outlawed, there were slave uprisings, whatever. And so a lot of the shipping families, starting with the British ones, turned to the opium trade. They picked up processed poppy in India and then brought it up to southern China, Canton. And the British, at one point the Chinese said, we don't want your opium anymore. Later on, I think the number was a third of all Chinese citizens, 90 million of them became addicted to opium.
Oh,
it was
my gosh.
huge problem. And they said to the British, no more. And the British said, sorry, and they came in with gunships blazing, and they started bombing, sending shells in, and the Chinese said, okay, fine. And then the Americans said, well, if the British get to do it, and so the Americans sent an ambassador over in the 1840s and did basically the same thing. That ambassador, by the way, was Caleb Cushing, Newburyport's own, and he negotiated a treaty to allow the Americans to sell opium in Canton as well. And it was a number of the big Essex Junta families became a huge part of this opium trade. But that's so it was originally slave money, sort of dirty money, and then became dirty money through opium.
Drug trade.
It was a huge problem. Yeah.
Yeah. And to put that in perspective, when I was reading about it in your book, it's kind of like having a fentanyl trade.
Very similar.
More about
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
Because the devastation was enormous.
It was.
90 million people in China being addicted to it, with, of course, the consequent mental health and physical health harm.
I think it affected them for
everyone.
generations.
So, yeah. Well, Dave, I don't want to give anybody spoilers about your book because there's so much kind of satisfying suspense in it, but I do want to learn more about some of the secret societies that form the backdrop for your book. And like myself, I guess that many people have heard the names, but not necessarily known what their mission was or what secrets they were keeping and why. And I want to start with the Knights Templar, about whom you've written a series of books.
Right.
Actually, Dave, what originally drew you to your own interest in the Knights Templar, and why do you think they continue to fascinate so many people?
They do fascinate even today. So prior to living in Newburyport, my wife and I raised a family in Westford, which is over near Lowell, up Route 495. You mentioned Kimball's Ice Cream and the Butterfly Place beforehand.
Yes, they're famous for that.
So those two things, and also they're famous for something called the Westford Knight, spelled with a K. And it's a historical site in downtown Westford, and the legend is that in 1398, 1399, 100 years before Columbus, Scottish explorers, following the old route the Vikings took, island hopping their way across the North Atlantic, ended up coming to the mouth of the Merrimack River here in Newburyport, up the Merrimack, disembarking, coming up to Stony Brook, a little smaller river, and ending up in Newburyport. And the legend is that one of the men died on this trip, and they carved an effigy to memorialize his death on the rock ledge atop the high hill in Westford. And that's what we have today. We have a carving. You can still see the battle sword carved in, and maybe you can make out the head and the shoulders and the shield of this knight.
That's fascinating, Dave.
But that's the story, that 100 years before Columbus, the Scots were here. So it's a fun story. And my daughter came home from school one day. She was in 4th or 5th grade. And I said, what did you do today at school? And she was young enough she was still talking to her parents at that point, telling them what happened at school. And I said, that's fat. And so I had written 3 legal thrillers. And I was looking for something to write about for a 4th. And I said, that might be a fun little subplot to put into a 4th legal thriller. Yeah. Well, instead of that, it became book 1 of 19, now 20, coming out soon, 20 books about the Knights Templar and the fact that they may have been coming to America before Columbus, because it turns out the Scottish explorers were the descendants of the outlawed Knights Templar. The Templars were outlawed in 1307, and a couple generations later this group may have come over. And the Templars are fascinating because, again, for about 200 years during the 1200s to 1400 period, 1100s to 1300 period, they were like the most powerful force in Europe. And then mysteriously they were outlawed by the church and sort of went underground, and some people think they reconstituted themselves as the Freemasons. Some people think they came back as the Knights of Christ in Portugal. It's like when you outlaw the mafia, they don't necessarily disappear, they just go underground.
Reformulate.
But the one thing about the Templars that everyone agrees on is they had this huge amount of wealth, this huge treasure that was never found. And so the question is, where is the treasure?
Yeah.
Getting back to today's story, what first got me onto this was that Albert Pike, who I mentioned was the son of Newburyport and a leading Freemason, head of it's called the Grand Commander of Freemasonry for about 30 years. He had some letters that were discovered up in Canada, and these letters talk about the fact that the Templars might have been in America, and it alludes to their treasure. And that's what first got me looking at Albert Pike. I had no idea the story was going to lead me back to Newburyport, but it was my interest in the Templars that got me looking at Pike and Pike's letters, and that's what brought me back to this story.
Yeah. Oh, that's just fascinating, Dave.
It was. It was one of those, like you said, following the breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
I followed them all around out to the western part of the country and up to Canada, and then all of a sudden they led me right back, literally to a half mile from my home. in Newburyport.
Yeah,
And
yes, right.
That was
There is
crazy because Pike grew up.
Spoiler exactly, but there was a treasure hunt in the novel.
There is, yes. And Pike grew up right near the Bartlett Mall. I mean, he was literally a half mile from the waterfront. So I was shocked to find myself back home again.
I know, it has a certain kismet quality to it.
Very much.
And it sounds to me as though you owe some credit to your daughter's fourth grade class here.
It's funny.
For launching.
I did a talk at the Lowell, UMass Lowell Learning and Retirement Association a few months ago, and who did I see but my daughter's teacher, the very one.
Oh, no kidding.
And Esther Wickonder, if you're watching, and she recognized me right away, and I recognized her, and we shared that same story. And I said, you have no idea, Esther, what you've set in motion.
Oh, that's great.
It was very funny to see her 20 years later.
That's amazing, Dave. Yeah. Well, we need to talk some about the Freemasons because they play a prominent role in the plot. And I'm curious to find out what they originally stood for, whether that's changed, how popular they are now. And they do not come across well in Essex Junta. Yeah. And so I wondered if you've heard from them.
Well, it's funny because I write about the Freemasons a lot. And I do a lot of lectures at Masonic lodges, and I have a number of very close friends who are Freemasons. And generally speaking, I portray them in a very positive light in my books. This one, not so much.
Okay.
I needed a villain. I needed something to move the plot along. And so in this particular book, the Grand Master of the state of Massachusetts is portrayed very negatively.
Yeah.
It wasn't always that way. He had a head injury, and it sort of changed his personality. Okay. But yes, they're not portrayed well, and that's just mostly because it's a plot device. I needed there to be some tension. I needed there to be villains. We'll talk more about some other villains later on. But they are surprisingly accepting of that. I think because I built up some credibility over the years with them, portraying them in a positive way prior to this.
You've got an exemption for this one.
I'm going to get out of jail free card. But it's a fascinating, the idea of the Freemasons is fascinating because back then, when the book was set in the 1800s, they were incredibly powerful. And people said that Freemasons are trying to take over the world. And back then, we have evidence. We have letters from Pike to a compatriot of his over in Europe, a guy by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini, who was in charge of the Illuminati. So the head of the Freemasons and the head of the Illuminati are writing back and forth, talking about trying to take over the world. No doubt about it. Back then, they probably were. Today, I don't think so. There are not as many of them. Their numbers are down. They used to have as many as 4 or 5 million members in the United States. They're down to about 1 million. They're just trying to hang on. I don't think they're trying to take over the world. I just don't see it. But I think back then they had ideas, and the reason for it was the Catholic Church was very much opposed to them. They were really butting heads. The Church felt threatened by them because the idea of Freemasonry is taking good men and making them better. And the Masons believe they don't need the church, they don't need organized religion to sort of to achieve spiritual perfection, as it were. And the church, of course, is threatened by that. The church says, no, we take good men and make them better. And so the Pope outlawed the Masons. The Masons didn't react well to that, and there was this clash between them. And that continues today. It's still today, church teachings are that you cannot be a good Catholic and also be a Freemason.
Interesting.
It's one or the other. That continues today. But back then, both entities, both the church and the Freemasons, were much more powerful than they are today. So, in the period after the Civil War, that was a big conflict.
That's really, I'm always interested in reading about the Masons because my dad was from Tennessee, and he had been a Mason. He had a ring. He never talked about it, but I always remember being interested in his Masonic ring. He married an Irish Catholic, and so I don't think it meant, he obviously was not involved in it, but he would never talk about it. He just, and I always assumed there was some secret loyalty oath that he must have taken as a young man, and he kept the ring. Yeah, the oath is, it's a really elaborate oath. Basically, it says if I give away the secrets, I agree to be my throat slit and to get graphic. Well, they lay you out in the beach during low tide, and it's all thing. But okay, Dad, you're forgiven for not talking about it. Very specific about what happens to you if you did it from the oath. And so I get the question all the time when I speak at lodges: how you know so much about it, and you write so much about it, Brody. How come you haven't joined? And I say because if I do join, I don't think I can write and talk about it as much as I want to. an oath.
Right.
Yeah,
And so, my job is to write and talk about it.
There you go.
Your job is to have the pancake breakfast on Sunday morning. So,
There you go. Everybody's role is defined.
Yes, that's right.
Well, the Theosophists also play a role in your book. And though they are different in aims, I know they appear to have some historical connection with the Freemasons. And so I was
Right.
hoping, I think a lot of people, again, have heard of the Theosophists, but may not know exactly what they were. They associate them with esoteric kind of
Yes.
aspirations. But could you tell us a little bit about who they were and who they are today?
Right. They even have a closer association with the Illuminati than with the Freemasons. Giuseppe Mazzini, who was the head of the Illuminati during this time period in the mid-1800s, was very close friends with a woman named Madame Helena Blavatsky, who
Yeah.
was sort of the leading Theosophilist back in that day. She, in fact, he was a revolutionary, an Italian revolutionary. She went over and fought with him and was injured in Italy. And again, he was trying to do the same thing the Freemasons were trying to do, which is remove the church from influence in government. So he was fighting that same battle, which is why he and Pike were so closely allied. At some point, Madame Blavatsky passed away, and the reins of power for the Theosophilist Society passed to a woman named Catherine Tingley, daughter of Newburyport. And so she moved the headquarters of the society here to Newburyport. She bought the Lord Timothy Dexter mansion, and what would have been a really fun thing had it ever actually happened. Her plans were to turn that mansion into a school of esoteric thought for children, almost like a Hogsworth school of witchcraft and wizardry. It ended up not happening because there was a big fire there. But in my book, I used that site because today it's apartments, and one of my characters takes an apartment there, and she finds these letters from Albert Pike. In reality, the letters were found in Canada, but for fictional purposes, I have the letters found here in Newburyport. But that Lord Timothy Dexter mansion, and the Theosophists, and again, all roads seem to lead back to Newburyport. It was fascinating that I just kept coming back to where I lived.
Newburyport, the hub of the universe.
It definitely seemed that way, for certain.
No, I loved it that the pivotal location was the Lord Timothy Dexter house. I did a show about Lord Timothy Dexter a number of years ago, and he's just such a fascinating character.
Absolutely.
And just either a genius or the luckiest man that ever lived. Or, I don't know, they're not mutually exclusive categories, but anybody who can make money off selling coals to Newcastle is doing something.
He had crazy stories, yes.
He is. And I remember asking a historian named Leslie Landrigan I was speaking to, I said, well, why did people call him Lord Timothy Dexter? And she said, he paid them to.
Yes.
I felt, of course, that's why. So, well, I did also want to ask you to also about the Skull and Bones, which you mentioned previously in terms of the Junta families, but they play a role in the plot too. And so, just tell us a little bit more. I know they're very secretive, but tell us a little bit more about the Skull and Bones Society.
Right. So again, Freemasonry, Illuminati, Skull and Bones, all these societies were very powerful. They all seem to have very close ties to Newburyport. So again, the Essex Junta families here on the North Shore, there are also a group of families on the Connecticut, shipping families from Connecticut, the Russell family. At one point, the Russell family and the Perkins-Cushing family, the two leading opium dealers, merged together to create one giant syndicate. So that's really the Essex Junta families.
Yeah.
The Russell family in Connecticut, it's their offspring who formed the Skull and Bones Society at Yale. The Skull and Bones was formed basically as a place to indoctrinate the sons, not the daughters yet, of course, still only sons, of these shipping families. In fact, originally, the Skull and Bones was Illuminati Lodge number 322. It wasn't known as Skull and Bones. It later became Skull and Bones. But so again, we find that these shipping families and these secret societies were closely allied. Freemasonry, Illuminati, Skull and Bones. So in many ways, sort of the big three. And the fourth one also, Knights of the Golden Circle down south. Pike founded that, which is another secret society. But all four of them have roots back to Newburyport. And again, my theory is that it was these secret societies were being used sort of as infrastructure for these powerful families to do their bidding and to organize and to recruit young, intelligent young men to help with their cause.
Yeah. Well, it's just so fascinating. All of the kind of, it's like a lattice work connecting all of these different secret societies, both historically and, of course, in your book as well.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about was I was really interested, Dave, to find that you included a subplot in your book regarding the misogynistic incel.
Oh, yes.
Some people may not even know that incel represents involuntary celibates.
Right.
Because I think a lot of people are just catching on to the danger that they present to women and girls, although there's a new Netflix show we were talking about a little bit before the show today called
Right.
Adolescence. It's a British show that is shining a powerful and very tragic light on boys and young teens, especially being kind of groomed into incel culture. So I was glad you included this episode in your book. So please tell us a little bit about what made you decide to, who the incels are, what makes them dangerous, and your decision to portray an assault, a violent assault on a female character in your book.
Right. So you always need villains in these stories, you know. And we mentioned I had the Freemasons, and that's sort of a little bit cliched, the Freemasons again. But I also try to be topical and look around, and this incel culture is a really ugly, dangerous thing. People ask me sometimes, why are it's similar in my mind, similar in some ways to some of these conspiracy theories that we see all the time, and I think there's a common thread. That it used to be that if there was a pocket of one or two people who had strange beliefs that we find unacceptable, they were sort of isolated. But now, with the power of the internet, they can gather together.
Yes.
They can find each other, whether they are conspiracy theorists or whether they have this incel culture. They find each other and they organize, and through this organization and through their volume, they then feel like their behavior becomes normalized.
Yeah.
It becomes an echo chamber. And that's really one of the things that's happened in modern society today, which we didn't have a generation or two ago. So the internet's a great thing, but it's also got an ugly side, and one of those ugly sides is this proliferation of these groups like the incel culture. It's I'm father of two daughters. That kind of stuff is sort of nasty. But yeah, that is one of the subplots, one of the villainous things that happens in the story is that.
Yeah, I was glad you included it as an opportunity just for people to learn more about it, because those algorithms connect people who might start out with just a mild interest. I've heard of it. What is it?
Right.
And then the algorithms will, they're just the social media is set up that way to lead you to more and more. And people use the word grooming boys and young men into this culture, which just creates a kind of, it normalizes it. It gives validation to it.
It's very similar to the group of people that believe that this New World Order thing we talked about a little bit earlier. This idea that these families, these powerful families, are continuing today to try to create a New World Order. Again, I don't believe that's still happening, but I have people come to my lectures and they say, "How can you not? You laid it all out. How can you not see it?" And my answer is, just because it was happening in the 1800s, I don't think families necessarily walk in lockstep like that generation after generation after generation. RFK Jr. does not walk in lockstep with his family.
No, he certainly doesn't.
Mary Trump doesn't walk in lockstep with her uncle.
That's right.
But the argument could be made that these families continue to try to impose a new world order just as they were trying to do 150, 200 years ago.
Yeah.
But these conspiracy theorists find each other on the internet and get together. And again, I had a group of 5 or 6 of them come to a lecture recently. Very nice people. They were going to go out to dinner afterwards. But the thing that brought them together was this belief that the New World Order was imminent and that they were opposed to it.
Well, that's really interesting, Dave. Yeah. Well, it's just fascinating to talk to you, and I learned so much from your book and even more from talking to you. But is there anything I have not asked you about, Dave, that you'd like to share with folks?
We did a pretty good job on it. I think that for me, the big takeaway was that we think of Newburyport today as sort of a nice place to come and visit, have lunch, and we've relocated there.
Yeah.
Back then, it was in many ways sort of I won't say the center of the universe, but it was a very powerful area, and many roads did lead back to Newburyport. And I was surprised to see how many powerful people working through these secret societies, what they were doing, and what a huge influence they had, and more to the point, how we just didn't really learn about it in school. I never learned about this Essex Junta thing. It was fascinating to me. We talk about how dare the South try to fracture our union.
Yeah.
The North here, 50 years earlier, were trying to do it themselves.
Right.
and I don't, it's not. I don't think it's like a conspiracy to keep us from knowing these things. I don't believe that. The history books are only so long. My daughter's a history teacher. She only has so many days she can teach, and got to teach World War I and World War II. So I get that, but it's fascinating to me the stuff that has been left out of the history books.
Yes, that's right.
And that's what I like to do. I like to go back and find that, whether it's the Templars perhaps being here before Columbus, or this kind of stuff, or other things. I like to go into the dusty corners of history and crawl around there and write about it, mix it up.
Well, I'm glad you do, Dave, because I think that it's important for us to know the truth about what people are and what has happened in the past, because when it gets left out or covered up, we're not prepared to recognize the earliest warning signs that something untoward or something dangerous or something undemocratic is actually happening. And so I'm glad that you're mixing up the Dust Bowl of history, which is exposing things that are there. And isn't it interesting, as you say, that Newburyport is at the heart, or is like a convergence place for a lot of these, especially for the Junta family, certainly.
Yes.
So it really is fascinating. Were you going to say something?
No, you started hinting at sort of today's political climate, and we don't need to go there. But yes, no. I think it. The lessons of history are relevant, especially today.
Absolutely,
yes.
Absolutely. So it's good that we know as much as possible about the past, because we're better prepared then to know what to expect.
Right.
Well, there was one more thing I'm curious about, and
yes.
that is, how do you manage to be so prolific? I know it's clear that you love the research that you do and you have a passion for it, but still, how do you manage to be so productive?
So I read Stephen King, the famous writer, wrote a book once, a guidebook for writers, and he said, the one lesson I will give young writers is you need to write every single day.
Interesting.
And I thought that was a laudable goal, and the more I started thinking about it, it makes sure you do it, so that's important. Because there's no, you don't have a boss who said you don't have to clock in. There's no schedule, but if you let yourself not do it, then it never gets done. But more to the point, when you write every day, you never lose the thread of your story. So you're always thinking about it. So I make a rule. I write every single day, even only for half an hour, no matter where I am, if I'm on vacation, if I'm whatever, I always do it. If I go skiing, whatever, I find a half an hour. And that way, when I go to pick it up the next day, my subconscious has continued to think about it while I'm in a shower or while I'm driving. And that way, I never lose the thread of the story. So every day, at least a half an hour. And then I love it. So it's not really work for me. And I love the research and I love the writing. And so I do 2 books a year without fail. It's just, I just finished my first one for this year. And I've done 2 a year for the past 6 years. So
we have number 20.
Number 20 is coming, yes. It's called Templar Lies. And I dive into the world of artificial intelligence.
Oh.
We have a sophisticated AI model trying to find the Templar treasure. So maybe in a couple months I'll come back. I'll talk again. Okay, thank you. I find myself back. How about that?
Dave, thank you so much. It's been so much fun to talk to you.
Thank you.
I want people to know you do have a website.
DavidBrodyBooks.com.
Where you can get more information about all of Dave's books and also Dave's background and history. So thank you so much, Dave. It's really been so much fun to talk to you. I appreciate your visiting the morning show.
Thank you, Mary. My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Until then, everybody, be well. Farewell.